So again, we are on the road to the revolution, right? Definitely on the road to the revolution at this point. And in that little 12-minute clip, I think they kind of set the stage for us. So we want to go back and just flesh out a couple of things, and hopefully in a way that makes sense. Go up one, actually. If I can go up one, that'd be great. The computer has a mind of its own. So we want to see how we get to the revolution and what this has to do with this notion of becoming American that we kind of set up last time. Remember last time we looked at many events leading up to the revolution, especially some kind of longer term factors, right? I kept trying to phrase it as becoming American, this process of sort of becoming American. And I really want to frame it that way because I think it was a process. We're going to see some examples of what I mean here in a second. Right? It does not happen overnight. Yes, we're going to see some tipping points in that, but it's going to be a much longer, more difficult process than we might think. Even during the war, there's a lot of folks that are not sure that revolution is the way to go. Right? It's going to take a while to get there. But we also spent quite a bit of our energy thinking about the tipping point of the 7 Years' War. Remember, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War is the same conflict. Right? In England, they might call it the French and Indian War. Here, we might call it the 7 Years' War, but it's the same thing. And most importantly, for our purposes, it ends. Right? It ends in 1763, and that is going to make it a particularly important tipping point in the history of the U.S. Now, remember, Britain actually wins. Right? They're on the winning side. So, in one moment, I think they're incredibly excited about having finally defeated France. Right? This kind of thorn in their side. But then the bill comes, right? So at the same time they're super happy about winning, they also are going to be very stressed and strained about how does one pay the bill, right? They will obtain Canada from the French, right? So they get this massive landmass, but they also are going to be heavily saddled with debt. You sort of heard in the video, he's talking about they have difficulty even paying the interest on the loan that they had to take out for this war, right? So it's taking them half the budget, right? Just paying the interest. So they're in some trouble, right? They're in some trouble, and they're going to start looking for ways to raise revenues, which is going to involve us as colonies. They also now have to figure out how is it that you defend a vast empire, right? How does one defend a vast empire? Because that's expensive in and of itself, right? That exposes you to a lot of things in and of itself. So immediately the British Parliament will start looking for ways to raise revenues, looking for ways to raise funds. And that's going to mean taxes. And it's also going to mean sort of cracking down, paying more attention to these colonies that had been benefiting from benign neglect. Benign neglect is going to come to an end in 1763. So remember, before 1763, the British policy towards North America and its colonies had been one of salutary or benign neglect. They kind of left us alone, let us do our own thing in many respects, and we liked that. That's why it's benign. They leave us alone as long as we grow the raw materials that are needed, right, and send those back home. As long as we are buying British goods like British tea and other goods, we're kind of serving our purpose in the minds of most folks. We also should be doing things like buying our sugar from other British colonies, like British colonies in the Caribbean, for instance. So we need to produce these raw materials: tobacco, rice, indigo. Indigo is a crop that's going to be used to make dyes and like colors, like especially the color blue. We produce that as well. So as long as we're doing that, we're doing our job. But the relationship is starting to change. Remember, these colonies are growing up, as we've seen. They're not only growing in size, but I think they're also growing in the sense of their own importance. Right? They're growing in terms of the sense of imagined community that they have. What happens when you feel like what's in the interest of the mother country isn't necessarily in your interest? Yet, you're still a loyal British subject. Right? You're still patriotic, but what if you feel like the mother country is far? Right? Geographically speaking, it's far away, and in other ways, culturally, maybe it's far away. Economically, maybe it's far away from what's in your best interest. And so I think we're going to start to see this sense of independence, this sense of nationalism, this kind of American sense developing even before they really are using the term. So with this pressing need for tax revenues, we're going to see immediately after 1764 a number of things happen in relative short order. The Sugar Act, right? Sugar Act of 1764, which is mentioned here, is a good example. Now I think it's a good example on a lot of different levels. Number one, it shows that this is not just about the money, right? It's not just about the money. Often money is a symbol, right? Money can be a symbol of how much someone respects you. Right? So it's not just about the money. There's some politics as well as economics in this. Well, how do we know? Well, we can look at the Sugar Act specifically and get that message. What do you mean? Well, the Sugar Act of 1764 will actually lower the tax on sugar. Right? The Sugar Act extended, as they were saying in the video, the Sugar Act extended the Molasses Act from the 1730s. Right? But it actually lowered the tax that we had to pay. So imagine from Britain's side, I think they were probably very surprised. They're like, these colonists are going to love this. I could see them sitting down writing this act and like, man, we're going to lower the tax. The colonists are going to love this. This is going to be great, right? Everybody likes lower taxes, right? So they write this up and send it our way, and we're like, oh, heck no. We're like, I might have cursed a little bit. I don't know what happened, but there was a surprising reaction in the colonies. Why? Because it wasn't just about the money, right? It's about other things. In addition to lowering the tax, Britain's like, okay, look, you got to pay less, but you actually got to pay it. Right? All that smuggling you've been doing, all the little side deals, that has to stop. Right? That has to stop. And we're like, oh, I think we literally made that noise. I read that somewhere. And so it's not just about the money. It's about this idea of control. I think it's about the changing relationship between a mother country and her colonial children. Right? We're growing up, and we're going to start asking certain questions that children don't usually ask, right? And we're going to start demanding some answers as well, slowly but surely. Not right away, slowly but surely. So the Sugar Act actually lowers the tax, but it is not going to be well received. We will complain that this British policy violated our right to assess our own taxes. Right? It violates our right to assess our own taxes. Now, Britain is like, you're our colony. You have no rights. Right? We tell you what your rights are. And we're like, not so fast, right? We're free. And free and independent people have certain rights. But even though we're not happy with this decision, it will not lead to sort of massive protest. It will not lead to sort of blood in the streets and all that in 1764. We are upset about it, but we're not revolutionaries yet. We're not revolutionaries. Now, the next act in 1765, the Stamp Act, is going to push things a little bit further. Right? It's going to push things maybe quite a bit further in terms of the reaction. People are going to be quite upset in the colonies about the Stamp Act of 1765, and it would cause major unrest. Right? It would cause major unrest. Well, what is it? The Stamp Act, as you heard, was a tax on written documents. Right? A tax on written documents. So things like newspapers, legal documents. If you had to get a license for anything, you had to buy a stamp and affix it to the document, right? So some historians argue that more people are going to be affected by this, right? Maybe the Sugar Act is more of an elite thing, right? If you're a sugar merchant or if you're wealthy and you drink a whole bunch of tea, right, then you got to pay extra money on your sugar. But maybe most, poorer folks might not be able to afford sugar anyway. But this Stamp Act seemed to affect more of the colonials, right? More of the imagined community, you might say. And perhaps that's part of the reason why. Maybe because it's second, right? Maybe they already got warmed up with the first one, and now this Stamp Act is really going to push people. It would lead to bitter protest. How do they respond? Well, colonial leaders decide to have a meeting. Right? They decide to set up a meeting in October of 1765, which they will call the Stamp Act Congress. Stamp Act Congress. Now, at this meeting, they decide, okay, what are we going to do to show how upset we are? What are we going to do? Well, they decide to draft a sternly written letter to the king. They're like, we're going to give him a piece of our mind. Right? Not really. They do draft a letter, but it's really much more of a kind of conciliatory letter. It probably sounded something like this. Oh, wise king, in your infinite wisdom, having governed us for so long with perfect record. Please just take away this tax. We're not getting crazy, but this tax is just not for us. You think you can get rid of it? They're very, very conciliatory. They are not revolutionaries yet. They're not saying things like, "Look, you better take this tax out." Right? We're Americans. You don't want these problems. They're not doing any of that, because that would have been a serious step towards revolution. Right? They are not ready to take that kind of a step yet. But look at how they are reacting. Right? They're meeting as a group. Right? So they recognize, look, this isn't just about one colony. This is about all of the colonies as a unified, imagined community. Right? They're essentially acting like a nation before they become a nation, you could argue. So this meeting is important. This kind of Stamp Act is important. So they try to be conciliatory, not confrontational. I would say it's still significant, though, in part because this is the first meeting of the entire colonial group since 1754. Remember, we talked about the Albany Plan of Union, right, where they were thinking about forming this Albany Plan of Union in 1754. Well, this was the first time the colonies had met as a group since then. So I think it is significant in that sense. Now, some of the other ways that they react to the Stamp Act are important, too. The king has representatives who are selling stamps throughout the colonies, right? So sort of representatives of the crown. And in certain areas, these stamp salesmen are getting harassed. They're getting intimidated. Imagine walking down the street and they're getting catcalled. "Hey, lobster bag, you better not come around here with that. Right? Come around this corner. We got something for you." They're doing stuff like that. Now, I think that's significant because these are representatives of the king. So in essence, you're challenging the king's power. Some of these stamp collectors get beaten up. Right? They might tar and feather a few folks. So much so that by November 1765, most of these stamp sellers had quit. I imagine this is your job. You're like, "Man, this is not worth minimum wage. These Americans are crazy, right? It's like, I'm not here for it. Let me go get a safer job. Let me do something else, anything else." So I think it is significant in that sense that folks are responding, even though they're still being conciliatory towards the king. Now, do you think it works? I don't know if you heard in the video. Do you think these strategies, this sternly worded letter, do you think it works? How many would think, by show of hands, how many would think that these tactics would work? Yeah. They actually do. They actually do work, surprisingly. Right? Parliament rethinks these things, and they will repeal the Stamp Act. They're like, "You know what? Our bad. Sorry about that. Let's just let bygones be bygones. Let's forget about it." Imagine the American response. Like, "Well, okay, we got a little power." I think they start to feel themselves a little bit. They're like, "Okay." They recognize that we're serious, right? But in addition to repealing the Stamp Act, Britain will issue the Declaratory Act. Declaratory Act. Now, basically, the Declaratory Act is them declaring that they have the right to tax us however they want. Right? So basically, England's like, "Look, we're going to take away that Stamp Act, but just so you know, we can tax you however we want, whenever we want. So we're making the decision to take it back, but don't get too full of yourselves, basically." Right? So this is the Declaratory Act. And exactly that will happen. Right? You will see subsequent taxes and duties kind of coming down the road. There will be subsequent duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Right? Glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. So a whole bunch of colonial products will be taxed. These will become known as the Townshend Acts. Townshend Acts in 1767. They were named after the British Lord Townshend. So all these taxes are coming at us. We're like, wait, I thought we worked this out. I thought you all were getting rid of taxes, right, from the American side. And from the British side, they're like, "Look, you are good colonial British subjects. You need to do your part. You still need revenues. We have the right to tax you however we see fit." Now, these Townshend Acts will lead to further protest. We're bent out of shape again about this, right? We thought we had an understanding, and apparently we do not have an understanding. So how are we going to respond? I think, again, the response is significant. The colonial response is significant. One of the ways that they will respond is through a non-importation movement, right? A non-importation movement, which basically is exactly what it looks like. Non-importation. It's a boycott. Right? I think it indicates the fact that these colonials are kind of feeling their economic strength. They're like, okay, you want to put taxes on products? Guess what? We're not going to import any British products. Doesn't matter what the tax is if we're not buying it. What's significant, I think, also about this is that everyone could participate, right? Especially housewives. Who's in charge of going to the market and getting all the goods that the family needs? Housewives. Right? They're the ones making the choices about which goods to buy. And so these housewives, these women in particular, who you might not think are political, quote unquote, they can't vote and such. They're being very political. They're like, nah, that's British. Okay, we're not buying that. Let's buy American. So you talked about the wearing homespun clothing, right? Clothing made here in the colonies, not made in England. This is a conscious decision, but it's a political decision. It's basically showing that you understand the power of the pocketbook. If you feel disrespected, don't spend your money on something. That's always been a great way to try to push for change. So this non-importation movement, I would say, is nationalism. Right? It's also economic resistance in various ways. So is it going to work? Right? We begin this non-importation movement. We vow not to get British products, to boycott them until all of the taxes are lifted. And all of the taxes will ultimately be repealed. Once again, we're like, man, this is fantastic. They don't want to mess with us, right? Except for a tax on tea. Right? All of those taxes are repealed: glass, lead, paper, paint, but not tea. And I think in many ways, think about the symbolic importance of tea for British culture, right? This is a really important cultural aspect as well as economic. And so they're like, okay, y'all can have all those other taxes, but no, the tea stays. I think this is going to be an issue. Perhaps they're trying to show that they are still in charge, and we're trying to show that we will not be dominated, right? We are not children. Things will calm down for a while, but as we know, more taxes are coming down the pike. In 1773, for instance, the British will pass specifically a tax on tea, a tea act, in 1773. Now, what did this require? Basically, the British don't feel like it requires that much. The Tea Act required the colonists to buy their tea from the British company. They had to buy their tea from the British East India Company instead of Britain's Dutch rivals, the Dutch East India Company. Right? Now, from the British perspective, they're like, look, you should be happy to buy your tea from a British company. You're British. Right? This is good patriotic behavior. Why would you want to buy from our national rival anyway? The colonists are like, you know what? We kind of like Dutch tea better. Maybe we can get a better deal from them. Maybe we like the taste better, right? I prefer Dunkin' Donuts coffee to Starbucks. Should I have to buy Starbucks? Well, I kind of do, because there's a Starbucks on every corner. There's only one Dunkin' within like 20 miles of my house. But if everything was equal, I would go with Dunkin'. If I was told I had to buy one product, I wouldn't feel like I was kind of free in that sense. Right? So this is a sticking point, right? This is a particular sticking point. Again, the British were probably surprised that we were upset because the Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the legal price on tea. It actually lowers the price. So the British are like, well, what are you mad about? We're putting more money back in your pocket, but you got to pay it. Before you weren't paying it at all. So just because it's lower doesn't necessarily help the colonials from their perspective. So the colonials will protest not only because of the economics of this, but because they felt like the act was a way of sneaking in a tax without proper representation. Right? As colonials, we don't have a vote in parliament. So you start to hear phrases like no taxation without representation. Right? No taxation without representation is going to be a phrase as we get closer and closer towards revolution. Right? In a way, you're equating both economics and politics. Right? You're kind of linking them together. At least the colonials would start to do so. Now, who's going to be affected by such a tea act? In particular, merchants. Right? If you're a Boston merchant that deals in tea, you could lose your shirt, right, economically speaking. So merchants, in particular in New England, may have a real issue with this, right? If the British crack down on the smuggling that's happening with the Dutch, this could really impact, especially those folks in Boston and other cities, towns that are merchants. You're going to see a clip from a video later where the Adams, Samuel and John Adams, out of Boston, have a ship, or they have a shipping company, right? And they actually are involved in some smuggling. There's one scene where the royal official comes from England to inspect their ship, right? He kind of boards the ship, and he's like, look, I heard there's smuggling going on, I need to inspect everything. And the ship's crew kind of grab this guy, kind of lock him in a closet, right, until they can get all the contraband off the ship. Now think about that. You're essentially kidnapping the representative of the king, right? This is serious stuff. But it kind of shows their determination not to also be bound by what they feel are unfair taxes. And some of it's about money. Some of it is going to be about the economics of this as well. So people are getting upset, particularly in a place like Boston, right? In December 1773, protesters in Boston will dump British tea into the harbor, right? They dress up as Native Americans, Sons of Liberty and others. I don't know why they dress up as Native Americans. Maybe y'all can do some research on that. But they board the ship and dump all this tea into the Boston harbor. You heard in the video, they said about $4 million worth of tea. Big time. You could probably smell tea for blocks, right? They basically turned the Boston harbor into like a big glass of iced tea. A whole bunch of tea. So the British are not going to be happy about this. This is definitely protests that they will have to deal with, right? So this is the Boston Tea Party, and it's done in protest to the Tea Act. What is Britain going to do? They have to do something. You can imagine the British East India Company like, look, you got to deal with these Americans. They're acting like rebellious children. They're out of control. You're the parent. Show them who's boss. Right? Are you going to pay us for all this tea? This is an issue. So they will deal with this, and they will crack down. In retaliation for the Tea Party, Britain will do several things. They're going to issue a series of acts. They will call them the Coercive Acts. Right? They call them the Coercive Acts. We call them the Intolerable Acts. So think about this issue of perspective. Same acts. Right? They're coercive acts from the British perspective. Britain feels like we have to coerce these kind of rebellious children back in the line. Right? We have to correct them, show them who's in charge. And we say, no, these are intolerable. We can't put up with this. Well, what are the acts? What are they? Well, they do several things. One thing that they do is they close the port of Boston. Britain shuts down the port of Boston. All you got to do is bring a few British ships and park them in front of the harbor and say, look, if you come in here, we'll blow you out of the water. British Navy is the most powerful Navy on the planet. This doesn't take much. So Britain's basically like, look, okay, you like to play in the water? Okay, nobody's going to play in the water now. Think about how you punish children for behavior that you think is not becoming of them. So they closed down the port of Boston. That's one thing they do. They also would restructure the colonial legislature in Massachusetts. They restructure it. They kind of feel like these colonial leaders are a bunch of radicals. And so they break it up, restructure it. They want to put a royal official in charge. Put a royal official in charge and break up this colonial assembly. They feel like it's a responsibility we can't handle right now, right? We're not showing that we can handle it. They also restricted meetings. They said, look, you can't meet because you all are radicals, you're planning things. And just as important as anything else, they decide to send in British troops. They will send British troops in to Boston and surrounding areas. So the part of what they do is the Quartering Act, right? The Quartering Act says that the colonials are responsible for housing and feeding these British troops. So imagine a troop comes in, knocks on you, hey, I know you got a one-bedroom, but we got 3 soldiers. We need to kind of stay in here. What's for dinner? Right? You're like, what are you talking about? Right? Many colonials will object to this, even though, again, as sort of good Englishmen, as members of the empire, right, from Britain's perspective, you should be happy to quarter these troops. We feel like it's an occupation, and that resistance is necessary. In addition, some scholars talk about these professional soldiers that are now hanging out in Boston. Right? They got a lot of downtime. So what are they doing in their downtime? They're going to the local pubs, right? Maybe they get into a scrape or two with some of the local working men, right? Step on somebody's shoe, right? All of a sudden the club's got to get shut down. Or they're taking odd jobs. Right? Some of the working men are complaining that the soldiers are taking all the jobs. So there's some tension developing, and you're going to see it bubble over in Boston and surrounding areas. Right? These are the coercive acts or intolerable acts. How are we going to respond to these intolerable acts? Once again, we call a meeting. Right? We call a meeting. They put out a call for colonial leadership to come together, all get into the same room. And this will be the First Continental Congress. Right? The First Continental Congress in 1774. They come together and they meet and they try to figure out what's going to be their next move. Right? What's next? What do we do? How do we respond? In 1775, there will be some skirmishes, some many battles, bloodletting, between poorly armed colonists and British troops in Lexington and Concord. Right? So shots are going to be fired. And once people start dying, it's a little hard to kind of say, I'm sorry, and go back. Right? Once blood is spilled, things are going to escalate. So Lexington and Concord happened in Massachusetts again in 1775, and by the time the Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, fighting has already begun. At that point, the chances for reconciliation are slim. Even with this, the colonists are not yet revolutionaries. We're not declaring independence. We're not saying, you better get out of here, right? We feel like we're defending ourselves and that we're fighting for certain rights and principles. We have not declared independence in 1775. But the Second Continental Congress is kind of functioning like a rough draft of a government. Right? They're deciding what the next steps are going to be. They know that now they have to direct the early war effort. Right? The war has essentially begun, but they got to figure out how we're going to fight it, how we're going to win it. And they will make some important decisions at this Second Continental Congress in 1775. One important decision they make is appointing George Washington as commander. Right? Appointing George Washington as commander. Now, there are a couple of levels of significance to this, I would say. Where are all these events happening so far? Massachusetts, in and around Boston. So if you live in South Carolina, you're like, what does this got to do with me? It's a long way away. What does this have to do with me? If you live in Virginia, right, the most populous state at the time, or colony at the time, you're like, I mean, that's horrible, but that's 500 miles away. Right? So this decision, I think, to name George Washington as commander is going to be significant on several levels. Where is George Washington from? Virginia, from the South. So by naming him, some scholars say that this kind of widens the conflict, right? It sort of broadens its significance. This is not just about Boston anymore, right? This is about the colonies and how the colonies will respond and how they will fight. So in choosing someone from Virginia, right, this very important colony, in choosing an elite figure like George Washington, right, slaveholder, fairly wealthy, it shows that this is a serious conflict. It shows that everyone should be invested in some way in such a conflict, right? Poor and working class folks are like, man, if George Washington's risking everything, well, why can't I? Right? Why shouldn't I? I think it does broaden this. Plus, it's going to be a really good choice. Right? Washington is a good choice. Some could argue maybe he's the only choice in some respects, and that he's going to play a pivotal role in this. Now, what's interesting is, again, some of the indirect consequences of history. George Washington had wanted to be a British general. Right? He wanted to be a general in the British Army. That was his aspiration. But he is told as a colonial that he's not really what they're looking for. Right? So you can imagine George Washington having a chip on his shoulder. Right? Oh, I'm not good enough? Right? I'm not good enough to be a general in your army? Okay. I'll see you a little later. Right? So when he gets the opportunity to lead the colonial forces, he had to be thinking about all of these things. Remember, too, that Washington does have military experience. Right? He had gotten experience during those conflicts with the natives, including the French and Indian War. Right? So he's seen battle. He's had experience. He had a chance to sort of work some things out earlier. So he's prepared for the fighting, even though we are essentially a group of farmers, right? There are some folks with some military experience leading up to this conflict that's going to be really, really important. And Washington himself will be important, as we see here with the first couple of battles and such. Now, this is an important choice of Washington, but even with this, they're not confident enough yet to declare independence. They don't think that it would be a good thing in 1775 to declare independence. One of the reasons is that many of the delegates felt there was not yet enough popular support, that most of the people, or many of the people, still were loyalists. What's a loyalist? Still loyal to the British Crown. Right? So remember, this idea of an American identity is a process. It takes a lot. Even after folks have died, they still consider themselves Englishmen, just Englishmen that happen to live in the colonies. Many of them are like, okay, we're going to fight, and then we'll get our rights, we'll work it out, and then we'll come back together as a family. Right? Loyalists are going to persist throughout the war. Some colonies will have a larger loyalist population than others. But it's interesting that at this point, they still don't feel like there's enough popular support. But there are going to be a couple of things that will push people further in this direction. One of them is going to be Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Right? Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, is going to be an important vehicle, an important mechanism for creating this notion of nationalism, imagined community, American identity, and challenging, I think, British authority. Thomas Paine will publish this pamphlet in 1776, and it has a tremendous impact on popular opinion. It is an instant bestseller. It goes viral. Right? It goes viral. So one person buys it and reads it. They pass it along to a friend. They read it. They pass it along to someone else. So the same copy might get read 25 times. Right? But it's a bestseller for the time. Now, the pamphlet argues that the colonists have no obligation to the British king. We don't owe him anything, they say. Now, how do you make such arguments? Well, basically the argument is we don't have to be loyal anymore because the king is not acting like a king. Right? He's not fulfilling his duty, so we don't have to fulfill our duty. Right? So we have no obligation to the British king, who by his actions had, quote, surrendered his claim to the colonists' obedience. Right? He surrendered his claim to our obedience. It's sort of like Game of Thrones, right? Yeah, okay, the king is the king, but when the king becomes the mad king, somebody's got to deal with that, right? Somebody's got to deal with that. He's not acting like a king anymore. That's basically part of the argument. Now, this is questioning the idea of kingship. Right? The idea was you had to unquestioningly obey the monarch. So this is really an argument for republicanism, ruled by the people. And it's questioning this notion of the monarchy itself. It's a direct attack on kingship. Some say that Paine's essay lays the intellectual foundation for American republicanism. Right? This notion of kind of rule by the people, for the people, right? That it may come here. It's also an appeal to common people, to the common man and woman. It's written in plain English, right, so that everyone can understand. He makes a number of kind of common sense arguments. Right? Think about the title, Common Sense. You heard one of them in the video, right? He says, how long should an island govern a continent? Right? They're like, look, England is a tiny little island, 3,000 miles away. How long are they really going to be able to keep us under wraps? Right? We're massive and growing. So I think it is this questioning of this relationship. So it's going to appeal to the common man. It's going to help kind of manufacture this sort of American nationalism, especially along the backcountry, especially along some of those non-English immigrants we talked about before. If you're Scots-Irish or Irish, or if you're German, you were never loyal to the British king anyway. So these arguments make perfect sense. You may have some gripes with the British king. So these arguments may also cause them to tip and become more vocal participants in such a movement. Right? Either way, the pamphlet will generate the popular support necessary to kind of make legitimate this revolutionary movement. And the leaders seem to understand this, right? That things seem to be moving in this direction. So with public opinion more firmly behind the idea of independence, even though there would be a number of loyalists that remain, the Second Continental Congress will vote to declare independence on July 2nd, 1776. July 2nd, 1776. A committee headed by Thomas Jefferson will be chosen to draft the formal Declaration of Independence, which is then going to be signed 2 days later, right? This is why we celebrate July 4th as our Independence Day.